In the late summer of 2023, in a part of the county that had been forgotten by the highway and the railroad alike, Silas Blackwood, age 78, adopted 100 hens that no modern hatchery would sell. The men at the feed store laughed, not with malice, but with the weary amusement reserved for old men and their final follies. They laughed until the first heat wave broke records, and the yard behind Silas's farmhouse showed the dark, cool mouth of an old stone cellar. Then the laughing stopped. Let me tell you about Silas Blackwood. He was born in the same clapboard house he lived in, delivered by the same country doctor who had delivered his father. He was 78 years old and had farmed the same 114 acres. He was known for two things: a silence that could outlast a winter storm, and a way of looking at the land as if it were a page in a book he had read 1,000 times. His hands were maps of his life, calloused and scarred from decades of fixing fences, pulling calves, and coaxing life from the tired soil of Harmony Creek. The farm wasn't a business to Silas. It was a covenant, a living thing passed down from his great-grandfather, who had cleared the land in 1888 with 2 mules and a profound distrust of banks. The farm had seen 7 droughts, 3 floods, and the slow hollowing out of the rural middle. It had survived the Dust Bowl, the farm crisis of the 80s, and the steady march of corporate agriculture that had turned his neighbors' fields into seas of uniform, genetically modified corn. Silas's farm was an island of anachronism. He still kept a small herd of 20 Hereford cattle, rotated his crops with hairy vetch and clover, and maintained a 3-acre woodlot his father had told him was the farm's savings account, never to be touched except in the direst of emergencies. The year 2023 was shaping up to be one of those emergencies. A high-pressure dome had settled over the Midwest in early May and refused to leave. By July, the creeks were bone dry. The price of feed had skyrocketed. Hay, what little there was being trucked in from 3 states away at a cost of $350 a ton. Silas had sold off 5 of his cattle, a decision that felt like cutting off a piece of himself. The money, $6,450 after fees, sat in a coffee can in his kitchen. It was supposed to get him through the winter. Instead, he decided to buy chickens. His grandson, Leo, who was 22 and studying agricultural business at the state university, thought the old man had finally lost his mind. Leo had come home for the summer to help, full of ideas about data analytics, drone-based soil mapping, and futures markets. He loved his grandfather, but he saw the farm as a case study in inefficiency. "Why chickens, Gramps?" Leo had asked, watching Silas mend an old roll of chicken wire. "In this heat, the price of starter feed is up 38% since April. The models all say to reduce livestock assets during a drought, not acquire more." Silas didn't look up from his work. He twisted a piece of baling wire with a pair of pliers his own grandfather had used. The pliers were worn smooth, the metal dark with the oil of 3 generations of hands. "The models don't know this land," he said. "They don't know the cellar." This was the first mention of the cellar in this context, and Leo had dismissed it. The cellar was a relic. A hand-dug hole in the ground behind the house, lined with fieldstone and covered by 2 heavy oak doors set at an angle against the earth. It smelled of damp soil and potatoes. As a child, Leo had used it as a fort, a cool refuge from the summer sun. It was part of the farm's folklore, not its business plan. Silas finished his repairs and stood up, his back cracking softly. "The big one," over in Concord. Concord was 72 miles away. The hatchery was Agrigen Futures, a state-of-the-art facility that supplied tens of thousands of chicks a week to commercial operations across the state. They were famous for their proprietary breed, the Sunbeam Gold, a bird engineered for maximum feed-to-egg conversion, and a placid temperament suitable for high-density housing. Leo had studied them in a class on livestock genetics. They were a marvel of modern science. They were also, he knew, expensive and fragile. The next morning, Silas drove his 1998 Ford F-150, a truck with 312,451 miles on the odometer. Leo went with him, armed with a tablet full of spreadsheets, convinced his job was to prevent his grandfather from making a terrible financial mistake. Let me tell you about Agrigen Futures. It wasn't a farm. It was a laboratory that happened to house chickens. The buildings were long, white, and windowless, cooled by massive HVAC units that hummed with the sound of money. The air smelled of disinfectant and processed feed. You didn't just walk in. You signed a waiver, stepped into a tray of sanitizing foam, and were met by a man in a polo shirt, with a logo embroidered over the heart. The man was named Mr. Davies. He was 34 years old, had a degree in poultry science from a prestigious university, and had been the facility manager for 6 years. He was known for his obsessive focus on metrics. He could tell you the average daily weight gain, the precise feed conversion ratio, and the projected lifetime egg output of any bird in his facility, down to the third decimal place. He greeted them with a firm handshake and a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Silas Blackwood," he said, reading the name off the appointment list. "You're here for 100 of our Sunbeam Gold pullets, a fine choice, best in the industry. Our data shows a 98.7% survival rate to maturity and an average of 320 eggs per year in a controlled environment." Silas nodded slowly. He was looking past him at the long, automated racks of incubators visible through a plate glass window. "I'm not here for your best," he said. His voice was quiet but carried in the sterile, echoing lobby. "I'm here for the ones you won't sell." Mr. Davies' smile faltered. "I'm not sure I understand. We only sell premium, genetically certified stock. Our reputation depends on it." "The culls," Silas said, "the ones that don't meet the standard." Leo felt a flush of embarrassment. He stepped forward, tablet in hand. "My grandfather is old-fashioned. We are, of course, interested in your premium Sunbeam Golds. I have a projection here of the potential return on investment, even with the current feed prices." Mr. Davies held up a hand, his attention fixed on Silas. He seemed to view the old man as a puzzle, a data point that didn't fit the model. "We don't sell our culls, Mr. Blackwood. They are a statistical inevitability in an operation of this scale. But they are not a commercial product. They are culled and processed for a protein meal. It's the most efficient and biosecure method of disposal." "Why are they culled?" Silas asked. "For any number of reasons." Mr. Davies began to tick them off on his fingers, a man comfortable in his expertise. "A slight deviation in comb formation. Leg angle that falls outside the 2.3-degree acceptable variance. Feather coloration that doesn't match the breed standard. Anything that our predictive models indicate could lead to a lower lifetime yield or a higher susceptibility to common ailments." "They're just chickens," Silas said. Mr. Davies gave a short, dry laugh. With all due respect, sir, they are production units. Our customers purchase a predictable outcome, a reliable asset. A batch of 10,000 birds needs to be uniform. A 5% variance in growth rate can throw off an entire operations feeding schedule and processing timeline. It's a matter of precision. What if I told you I don't care about precision? Silas's gaze was steady. I care about resilience. A flicker of something, annoyance perhaps, or professional pity, crossed Davies' face. Resilience is a byproduct of genetic superiority and optimal environmental control. It's not something you find in the reject. That's not my opinion. It's what millions of data points tell us. Our sunbeam golds are the most resilient birds on the market, provided they are housed and fed to our specifications. Silas was silent for a long moment. He looked at his grandson, who was staring at his shoes, then back at the hatchery manager. "Let me see them." Mr. Davies sighed, a man indulging a child. "It's against our biosecurity protocol, but fine." He led them through another set of sanitized doors into a cavernous room. The air was warm and filled with the chirping of thousands of chicks. In one corner of the room, separated by a low plastic barrier, were a few hundred birds. They looked, to Leo's untrained eye, exactly like the others. "These are the day's culls," Davies said, his voice flat. "Spet for processing at 4 p.m. You can see for yourself." He pointed to a chick that was slightly smaller than the rest. "That one is 11% below the median hatching weight. Our models show it will never catch up." He pointed to another. "See the slight discoloration on its leg? A potential indicator of a vascular issue." Another had a comb that was infinitesimally crooked. They were tiny flaws, invisible to anyone not trained to look for them. Silas walked to the edge of the enclosure. He didn't say a word. He just watched. He watched them for 10 minutes. He watched the way they moved, the way they interacted. He watched the ones that were bold and the ones that were timid. He watched the one with the crooked comb peck curiously at his boot. Davies and Leo stood in awkward silence. The hatchery manager kept checking his watch. Finally, Silas stood up. "They'll do," he said. "Do for what?" "I'll take 100 of them, sir. As I've explained, we do not sell these birds. They are a liability. We can't guarantee their health or productivity. Our brand is built on predictability. Selling these would be irresponsible." Silas reached into the pocket of his overalls and pulled out a worn leather wallet. It was held together by a thick rubber band. He took out 5 $20 bills and held them out. $100, $1 apiece. "You are going to turn them into feed. This is $100 you didn't have this morning." This was the moment of confrontation. It wasn't about money. It was about two irreconcilable worldviews colliding in a sterile, temperature-controlled room. On one side was Mr. Davies, a man who believed the world could be understood and controlled through data, models, and optimization. He believed that what was imperfect should be eliminated. On the other side was Silas Blackwood, a man who believed wisdom was found not in spreadsheets, but in the soil, in the seasons, in the accumulated experience of generations. He believed that what was imperfect had a place, that resilience was born from variation, not uniformity. Mr. Davies looked at the money, then at Silas's weathered face, then at the birds. It made no business sense, but there was also a strange, compelling logic to it. It was, as Silas had pointed out, $100 he didn't have before, and perhaps on some level he was curious. He wanted to see the old man fail. He wanted to see his data-driven worldview vindicated. "You'll sign a waiver," Davies said, his tone clipped. "It will state clearly that you are taking these birds as is, with no guarantee of any kind, and that Agrigent Futures is not liable for any losses incurred. You are acknowledging that you are purchasing substandard livestock." Silas just nodded. Fine. An hour later, the old Ford F-150 was rattling its way back to Harmony Creek, with 2 large cardboard boxes in the bed. The boxes were punched with air holes and contained exactly 100 assorted, rejected, substandard hens. Leo sat in the passenger seat, stewing in a mixture of shame and anxiety. He had run the numbers. Even at $1 a bird, the feed costs alone would eat up most of the remaining cattle money by winter. He was sure they had just purchased 100 tiny, feathered liabilities. He broke the silence after 30 miles. "Gramps, I don't understand. We could have bought 25 of the best. The Sunbeam Golds. My projections showed we could break even in 18 months. This is just gambling." Silas kept his eyes on the road. "The best ain't the best when the world changes," he said. "The world is changing." He didn't say anything more for the rest of the drive. The news of Silas Blackwood's purchase traveled through Harmony Creek with the speed of gossip in a small town. It was discussed over coffee at the diner, over beers at the tavern, and over the counter at the feed store. The consensus was uniform. Poor old Silas. In the middle of the worst drought in 50 years, he had spent good money on 100 chickens that the most advanced hatchery in the state was planning to destroy. It was the talk of the town for a week. Men would see Silas's truck and shake their heads with a sad smile. They called them Silas's Folly, or the dollar store chickens. Silas paid them no mind. He was busy. He and Leo spent 2 days converting an old tractor shed into a chicken coop. They built roosts and nesting boxes from reclaimed barnwood. Silas refused to buy the commercial pelletized feed Leo recommended. Instead, he drove to the grain elevator and bought separate bags of cracked corn, oats, sunflower seeds, and a protein supplement made from fish meal. He mixed it himself in an old wheelbarrow, adding in things Leo had never seen in a textbook: a scoop of diatomaceous earth to control mites, a handful of dried oregano from his late wife's garden for its antibacterial properties, and crushed oyster shells for calcium. "This is insane," Leo said, watching his grandfather stir the concoction with a shovel. "The nutrient ratios are all over the place. We have no idea what the protein percentage is. The commercial feed is perfectly balanced." Silas grunted. "This is what my father fed his chickens. It's what his father fed his. It worked for them. He let the 100 hens out into a fenced-in section of the yard. They were a motley crew. Unlike the uniform, honey-colored Sunbeam Golds, these birds were a patchwork of colors and sizes. Some were small and dark. Others were speckled white. A few had the crooked combs Davies had pointed out. They were a flock of individuals. They didn't move as a single placid unit. They scattered, explored, and immediately began scratching and pecking at the dry earth, foraging for insects and seeds that Silas's perfect hens would have ignored. The first few weeks were difficult. The heat was relentless. The temperature hit 100 degrees for 5 straight days in early August. 2 of the smallest hens looked weak. Leo was convinced they were going to die, proving Mr. Davies and his models correct. He imagined the smirks at the feed store. Silas did something Leo had never seen before. He brought the 2 weak hens into the cool of the farmhouse kitchen. He mixed a bit of molasses and apple cider vinegar into their water and fed them with an eyedropper. He sat with them for hours. By the next day, they were back on their feet, and by the end of the week they had rejoined the flock. The models had predicted they would be the first to die. They were the first to be saved. It was around this time that Silas started talking more about the cellar. "Let me tell you about that cellar," he said to Leo one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the hens peck in the twilight. "It wasn't built for chickens. It was built for people." He told Leo the story. His great-grandfather, Klaus Blackwood, had emigrated from a poor farming village in the Black Forest region of Germany in 1884. He had saved for 10 years to buy the passage for himself and his wife. He chose this piece of land because the creek reminded him of the one he'd left behind. But he knew the land here was different. The weather was violent and unpredictable. The winters were colder, the summers hotter, the storms more ferocious than anything he had known. He had seen his neighbors lose their entire year's harvest of potatoes and apples to a single hard frost in October or a week of rot-inducing humidity in the summer. So before he even finished building the house, he started digging the cellar. He dug it by hand, with a pickaxe and a shovel, loosening the dense clay soil one shovelful at a time. He hauled fieldstones from the creek bed on a stone boat pulled by his 2 mules, Molly and June. He was a stonemason by trade, and he built the walls without a speck of mortar, fitting the stones together so perfectly that they had stood for 135 years without shifting. The cellar was 12 feet deep, 5 feet wide. The thick stone walls and the 3 feet of earth overhead acted as a massive thermal battery. The temperature inside, Silas said, never went above 60 degrees in the summer and never dropped below 45 in the winter. It was the family's security. It was where they stored hundreds of jars of canned vegetables, bushels of apples and potatoes, and cured meats that would see them through the winter. It was where they took shelter when tornado warnings were issued. During the Great Blizzard of 1936, Silas's grandparents had lived in the cellar for 4 days with a milk cow to keep them warm. The cellar, Silas explained, was an answer to a question that modern agriculture had forgotten to ask. The question was not, how do you maximize yield in a perfect year? The question was, how do you survive in a bad one? Modern barns with their fans and automated waterers were designed for optimization. The cellar was designed for resilience. It was low-tech, inefficient, and almost perfect. The local news ran stories about farmers selling off entire herds. The big poultry operations on the other side of the county were losing thousands of birds to heat stress. The power grid was strained, and rolling blackouts meant their sophisticated ventilation systems would periodically fail, leading to catastrophic losses. Mr. Spurd, Davies's sunbeam golds, for all their genetic potential, could not survive in a metal building when the temperature inside spiked to 120 degrees and the fans shut off. They were premium assets in a controlled environment, but the environment was no longer controlled. Silas's flock, meanwhile, was adapting. They learned to spend the hottest part of the day, from noon to 4 p.m., under the shade of a large oak tree at the edge of the yard. They foraged relentlessly in the early morning. Because they were a diverse flock, they didn't all compete for the same resources. The smaller, quicker hens caught grasshoppers in the tall grass, while the larger, stronger ones were better at scratching up grubs near the compost pile. They were not a uniform production line, they were a functioning ecosystem. And they had started to lay. The first eggs were small, but they were numerous, and their yolks were a deep, rich orange that you never saw in a store-bought egg. Leo started to see. He stopped quoting his textbooks and started watching the chickens. He noticed things. He saw how the flock would collectively mob and chase away a hawk that flew overhead. He saw how they communicated with a complex vocabulary of clucks and calls. He was witnessing not a collection of production units, but a community. Then, on the 3rd week of August, the meteorologists called it a heat dome of historic proportions. For 19 consecutive days, the temperature in Harmony Creek did not drop below 102 degrees Fahrenheit. The nights brought no relief, with lows hovering in the mid-80s. The roads began to buckle, the leaves on the trees turned brown and brittle, the air was thick and hard to breathe. This was the test. This was the moment the entire story had been building toward. On the second day of the heat wave, the temperature hit 108. The hens were clearly suffering. They were panting, holding their wings away from their bodies, seeking any patch of shade they could find. Leo came to his grandfather, his face etched with worry. "Gramps, they're not going to make it. We have to do something. The coop is like an oven." Silas nodded. He looked at the sky, a pale, hazy white. He looked at his flock. "It's time," he said. He walked to the old oak doors of the cellar, the ones set into the gentle slope behind the house. He pulled on the thick iron ring on one of the doors. It was heavy, and he grunted with the effort. With a deep groan of old wood, the door swung open, revealing a set of steep stone steps leading down into the cool darkness. A breath of air, smelling of damp earth, and a century of stored apples washed over them. It was at least 40 degrees cooler than the air on the surface. Silas scattered a trail of cracked corn from the oak tree where the hens were clustered, all the way to the cellar entrance and down the first few steps. The hens were hesitant at first. They had never seen this dark opening in the earth. But one, the bold one with the slightly crooked comb, followed the trail of corn. It paused at the top of the steps, cocked its head, and then, tentatively, hopped down one step, then another. A few others followed. Within 10 minutes, the entire flock of 100 hens had voluntarily walked down the stone steps and into the cool, dark refuge of the 1-3-5-year-old cellar. Silas and Leo followed them down. The oppressive, suffocating heat was gone, replaced by a profound and steady coolness. The hens, which had been panting and stressed just minutes before, were now calm. They clucked softly, exploring the earthen floor. Silas had already prepared the space. He had spread fresh straw on the ground and set up temporary roosts. He had filled waterers with fresh, cool water from the well. They were safe for the next 2 weeks as the heat wave shattered every record and devastated farms across the region. Silas's 100 substandard hens lived in the cellar. Every morning in the relative cool before dawn, he would let them out for a few hours to forage. As soon as the sun climbed and the heat began to build, he would lay down another trail of corn, and they would march back down into their subterranean sanctuary. They not only survived, they thrived. They kept laying eggs. They kept gaining weight. They did not lose a single bird. The laughter in town had long since died. It was replaced by a quiet, bewildered respect. Neighbors who had lost half their flocks would drive past Silas's farm slowly, looking at the empty chicken yard and the closed cellar doors, trying to understand what was happening. The story of Silas's folly had transformed into the legend of Silas's Ark. On the day the heat wave finally broke, a familiar truck pulled into Silas's driveway. It was a shiny new pickup with the Agrogen Futures logo on the door. Mr. Davies stepped out. He wasn't wearing his corporate polo shirt. He was in a simple work shirt, and he looked tired. He had, he later admitted, lost over 30,000 birds at his main facility and had seen reports of up to 60% losses among his customers who raised sunbeam golds. His perfectly engineered birds, in their perfectly engineered environments, had been decimated. The control he had built his career on had proven to be an illusion. He walked with Silas and Leo to the cellar. Silas opened the heavy oak doors, and one by one, the 100 hens emerged, blinking in the newly mild sunlight, and began to forage as if nothing had happened. They were healthy, vibrant, and active. Mr. Davies stood there for a long time, just watching them. He was a man watching his entire belief system crumble in a dusty farmyard. "How many did you lose?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Silas looked at his flock, a motley, resilient, beautiful collection of rejects. "Not a one," he said. Mr. Davies didn't have an answer. His data had no column for a 135-year-old hole in the ground. His models had no variable for the wisdom of a great-grandfather who knew the violence of a Midwestern summer. He just shook his head, got back in his truck, and drove away. He was wrong, not because he was foolish, but because his knowledge was a mile wide and an inch deep. Silas's was an inch wide and a mile deep. In the aftermath, things changed. Leo abandoned his plans to get an MBA and came home to the farm for good. He spent the next year learning from his grandfather, not about spreadsheets and futures markets, but about cover crops, soil health, and the intricate history of their 114 acres. Silas's hens became local legends. People didn't want eggs from anywhere else. He couldn't keep up with the demand. He let his hens go broody and hatch their own chicks. He didn't select for uniformity. He selected for the hens that were the best mothers, the most clever foragers, the ones who seemed to know when a storm was coming. He was selecting for resilience. He called the new breed he was developing Cellar Browns. 2 years later, Agrogen Futures launched a new marketing campaign. They advertised a new line of birds, the Heritage Hardy line. selectively bred for environmental resilience and foraging instincts. They were, of course, more expensive. Silas saw the advertisement in a farm journal and just smiled. The story isn't about the chickens. Not really. It's about what we value. We live in an age that worships optimization, that believes what can be measured is all that matters. We believe in the data, the models, the experts who promise us predictability and control. We have built a world that is incredibly efficient, but also incredibly fragile. It is a world of sunbeam golds, perfect under perfect conditions, but helpless when the conditions change. What survives is not always the strongest or the fastest or the most productive. And adaptation requires variation, imperfection, the very qualities Mr. Davies was so eager to call. The crooked comb, the suboptimal weight, the slight deviation. They are the raw material of survival. Silas Blackwood passed away 3 winters after the great heat wave at the age of 81. He died in the same house he was born in. Leo runs the farm now. He keeps a flock of 500 Cellar Browns, all descended from the original 100 Recacts. The farm is more profitable than it has been in 50 years. And every summer, when the heat gets intense, Leo opens the heavy oak doors his great-great-grandfather built. He scatters a trail of corn, and he leads his flock down into the cool, dark, life-saving earth. He is not just sheltering his chickens, he is honoring a covenant. He is keeping a promise made to the land, a promise that resilience is worth more than efficiency, and that the deepest wisdom is not invented in a laboratory, but inherited. It is found in the cool, quiet dark of an old stone cellar.